A great nuclear war takes place on Earth, after which the survivors are struck by a plague. People survived as best they could, hiding in settlements scattered across the continents, praying only for the skies to finally clear and the ocean to breathe again. In 2013, several decades after the war and the collapse of modern civilization that followed, a nomad travels on a mule through the post-apocalyptic wasteland that was once the state of Utah. The man surveys the scorched desert and remembers a winter that lasted 3 long years and the barren, poisoned ocean. Now, for many days, he has been walking through lands where people once lived, but now only wild animals roam, those that miraculously survived. Soon the man reaches the remnants of a settlement where the wreckage of cars and buildings still stands. His mule immediately runs toward a puddle of water, but the man pushes the animal away. He must first check if the water is safe to drink. He tests it and concludes the liquid resembles turpentine more than water. However, this does not deter the mule, which brings an amused smirk to the man's face. While the animal drinks, the man enters a ruined diner and, sitting down on a couch, pretends to watch TV and read previews of upcoming television shows. Suddenly, a sound of something falling echoes behind him. The man grabs his rifle, but it turns out to be just a small antelope, scared of the human and eager to run as far away as possible. Startled by the animal, the man thoroughly searches the place. Finding an old vending machine, he breaks it open. Discovering several packs of real cigarettes inside, the man feels like a rich man and says so to his mule. He spends the night in the old building. When morning comes, the man explains to his mule that his main rule is to avoid civilization at any cost. That's the only way to stay out of trouble. Then he brushes the mule's teeth. Later, he arrives at a settlement where a one-man play based on Shakespeare's poetry is being performed on a small wooden stage for the residents. The show delights the children and the few adults in attendance. One of the women accompanies him on an old piano, making the performance rather engaging. In gratitude, they invite him to the table. Hot soup is on the menu today. Suddenly, the bell rings, signaling the arrival of the Holnist army that dominates the area. The townspeople reassure the traveler that the bandits rarely kill anyone nowadays and admit they are forced to share their supplies in exchange for peace. But the man chooses to hide behind the nearest house. Soon, the Holnist patrol enters the settlement. Their leader, General Bethlehem, demands to know what is going on. One of the children recites a poem he remembered, but this only irritates the general. The settlers didn't prepare enough game meat, yet somehow had time for a play. He announces a conscription into his army, selecting suitable men based on age and ethnic background, personally inspecting the population, and rejecting anyone with non-Caucasoid blood. Seeing this, the nomad tries to quietly slip away, but one of the kids notices him and waves. General Bethlehem sees this too. The man is captured. He tries to protest, explaining that he's just passing through, but he is struck in the head and loses consciousness. Sometime later, he and several other selected men are brought to a Holnist camp. The general announces that a new life is beginning for them. From now on, they are soldiers in the unified army of Nathan Holm. He asks what each man did in the old world. Learning that the traveler is an actor and knows Shakespeare's verses, the general recites a few lines himself to show off his education. He promises to turn the traveler into a real warrior. When the man refuses to fight, the general beats him and gives him the nickname Shakespeare. Later, one of the young men, Woody, brings him water. When the man regains consciousness, Woody asks him to recite the poem he read in the town again, the one that spoke of defiance and freedom. But then a guard reminds them they need sleep. In the morning, training begins. At dawn, the group of new recruits runs their first cross-country march, after which they have no strength left to resist anything. In the evening, they are served a meal made from the mule's meat. It is declared that such filth has no place in the New World. Shakespeare barely manages to suppress his true feelings. Meanwhile, General Bethlehem's aide, Captain Idaho, forbids feeding the last recruit in line for the cauldron, saying that if he's not in a hurry, he must not be hungry. The unlucky man protests, but there's nothing he can do. Then Shakespeare gives him his own portion. The young man swears he'll never be last again and vows to earn the general's favor. Later that night, the soldiers are shown an old action movie, but the audience begins hurling rocks at the projection booth. They already see enough violence and death every day. The projectionist is forced to switch to a beautiful musical love story that reminds them of the happier past. The people settle down, enchanted by the scenes on the screen. The next morning, the general explains that from now on, they will all live by 8 rules passed down by the great thinker Hone. Thus, the number 8 becomes their symbol. Each recruit will proudly bear it as a branded mark on their forearm. The first rule, obey orders without question. General Bethlehem orders everyone to sit. One man finds no chair and is immediately seized and hung upside down. He could have sat on the ground. This introduces the second rule, punishment must be swift. The poor man screams, begging for mercy, claiming he simply didn't know the rules. The general continues. Rule 3, mercy is for the weak. Rule 4, fear paralyzes reason. Therefore, Rule 5 demands absolute loyalty to the clan. Rule 6, justice can be enforced. Rule 7 states that any clan member may challenge leadership in combat. The general offers to fight anyone who dares, but no one steps forward. And Rule 8, the only punishment is death. With those words, the general kills the man who misunderstood his earlier order. He reminds the shocked recruits that if they work hard, they will always be fed. If they fight well, they will be respected. And if they die, they will be remembered. The general leaves. Sergeant Idaho explains that the last person who dared challenge the general, Colonel Getty, was left without a tongue and now follows her master everywhere like a loyal dog. Later, the general summons Shakespeare and tells him that before the war, he was just a regular electronics salesman. If not for his encounter with Holmes, he would have remained a worthless nobody. Holmes' book became his Bible, and now he's determined to build a new, pure, and just world. He also promises to make Shakespeare a fine officer because he sees intelligence in him, and smart people are in high demand. For now, General Bethlehem orders Shakespeare's binoculars to be given to the scouts and his book of poems to be burned. The man returns to the camp, now firmly set on escaping. He finds Woody and the unlucky one. He urges them to join him in the escape. Woody hesitates, unsure if he's ready to run, but Shakespeare encourages him to take the risk. Somewhere on the coast lies the city of St. Rose, where people still live in peace and prosperity. Their conversation is overheard by the unlucky one, but he refuses to run. He wants to earn favor here. The next morning, the unit led by General Bethlehem sets out on a hunt and eventually reaches an old suspension bridge over a river. The night before, on the other side of the river, the soldiers had shot a lion, presumably an escapee from a zoo. But the wounded beast fled into thick brush and has already injured a couple of soldiers, making the passage unsafe. Sergeant Idaho calls for a volunteer to find the animal. The unlucky one steps forward eagerly, but the sergeant sees he's unfit for the task. Woody, a giant of a man, also refuses to take the risk. So Idaho orders Shakespeare to search the bushes for the dead soldiers and finish off the lion. He's about to offer him a rifle with one bullet, but General Bethlehem, observing the scene, commands to give him only a knife. The man crosses the bridge and searches the thicket. He finds only a soldier's corpse. Hoisting the body onto his shoulder, he heads back. But as he walks across the bridge, he realizes this may be his only chance at freedom. He slows down. At that moment, a plank gives way beneath his feet and he falls into the river. The soldiers on the bank open fire, but the fast current carries the man to safety. Sergeant Idaho orders Woody to jump in and chase Shakespeare down, to kill him at all costs. The unlucky one runs along the riverbank in pursuit. Soon, Shakespeare reaches the shore, where the unlucky one finds him. The man asks the youth to step aside, but he refuses and starts shouting for the soldiers, revealing the escapee's location. Shakespeare is left with no choice. He kills him, but Shakespeare doesn't have time to escape. Woody appears on the riverbank. Shakespeare asks him to think before attacking, saying they can run away together. But then the sergeant shows up and goads Woody, demanding he kill Shakespeare. However, the young man refuses and stabs the sergeant with a knife. In retaliation, the sergeant kills the defiant boy. Shakespeare uses the distraction to disappear into the bushes. The wounded sergeant follows him and ends up in the jaws of the enraged lion. That night, having escaped pursuit, Shakespeare wanders through the rain, barely aware of his path. He is cold and exhausted. Seeking shelter from the rain and chill, he crawls into a wrecked van where he finds a mummified corpse, a working lighter, a flask of liquor, and a bag full of pre-war letters. To warm himself, Shakespeare puts on the dead man's clothes and starts a small fire with the letters. But as he looks at them, he starts reading, just to pass the time. Then he notices a cap with the insignia of the United States Postal Service. The man warms himself and remembers the old days. In the morning, after burying the mailman's remains and taking the letters with him, the wanderer, now dressed as a postman, sets off. The first settlement he encounters is Pineview, but the townsfolk refuse to let anyone in, as the sheriff declares from atop the wall. To get past the gates, Shakespeare pretends to be a mail carrier and claims he was delegated by the reformed government of the United States of America to restore communication between towns. The sheriff doesn't believe him and keeps him at gunpoint. To convince the townspeople, Shakespeare dumps the letters onto the ground and starts reading out the names of recipients until he calls out the name of one of the townsfolk. The gates open and a blind woman asks someone to read the letter aloud. The message turns out to be from her sister, written 15 years ago, a miracle in their eyes. This opens the gates of the town for the postman. Though some remain skeptical, the sheriff among them, most rejoice at the possibility of the world returning to peace and order. The postman is taken to a room where he bathes, and after putting on clean clothes laid out for him, he heads to dinner. The local bar is full. Nearly everyone has gathered to ask him about the new government. The postman tells them of the reborn Congress, now based in Minneapolis, and of President Richard Starkey, who has abolished all political parties and is working hard to rebuild the country. He says that Nathan Holn is dead, but the people remind him that Holnist followers still roam the land. They ask him to relay a plea for help to fight off General Bethlehem's bandit army. The postman replies that the government is still gaining strength, and for now people must rely on themselves. But the work has begun, and order will be restored. The townsfolk pray in thanks for the good news, and for the man who brought it. They declare it a holiday and celebrate. The postman doesn't feel well. He hadn't expected his appearance to have such a profound effect on the people. One of the townswomen, Abby, invites him to dance, and after asking about his health, unexpectedly requests that he give her a child. The postman is stunned, but Abby introduces him to her husband, Michael, who, due to medical issues, cannot have children. They would be overjoyed to have a baby from him. The man says he'll think about it, but then the blind woman calls out to him. She has written a letter to her daughter and asks the postman to deliver it, even though she doesn't know where her daughter might be now. Completely overwhelmed, the postman runs outside, deciding to flee the town by stealing a horse. But an old man stops him and tells him that what he's looking for is just around the corner. Not wanting to reveal his confusion, the postman goes where he's told and finds an old United States Postal Service building where a local boy named Ford is waiting. Inspired by his example, Ford wants to become a postman. Shakespeare has to invent a ceremony to induct him. Ford eagerly takes an oath to the made-up Postal Service. After sending the boy off, the postman settles in for the night, but soon the sheriff arrives. He had figured out right away that the man was a fraud and orders him to leave the town in the morning. After the sheriff leaves, Shakespeare sorts through the letters he found in the post office and suddenly comes across one addressed to St. Rose. But before he can read it, Abby enters. She tells him that the whole town is writing letters for him to deliver, and she has come for the child. Looking at the woman, the postman agrees to the deal. The couple spends the night together. In the morning, as he steps outside, he sees the townspeople gathered to see him off. They've decided to gift him a horse and some supplies for the road. They also hand him letters for their loved ones. The postman thanks everyone and promises to return one day because life is coming back, but for now, he's heading west. The sheriff walks with him to the bridge and before parting, asks if he truly is who he claims to be. The postman promises to return with more mail, and then they'll know the truth. As he starts to ride off, the sheriff suddenly catches up to him and hands him a letter as well. Sometime later, during a routine tribute raid, General Bethlehem and his men arrive in Pineview. To his great surprise, the general finds that the town has a functioning post office flying the U.S. flag, and the people believe the country's government has been restored. He demands that the flag be burned along with the post office and chooses Abby's husband to do it. The man has no choice but to obey. John tries to rush in and save the letters inside, but the sheriff barely stops him from drawing the attention of the furious general, who is now shouting that no such restored United States exists or ever will. The building goes up in flames, and the new postman barely manages to escape. Later, the general accepts tribute from the townspeople and notices Abby, who stirs something base in him. Her husband declares that she is a decent woman, but Bethlehem mocks his old-fashioned values and demands that Michael bless their intimacy. When the man refuses, Bethlehem kills him in front of everyone and orders Abby to be taken. Chaos erupts. People cry and scream, but are powerless against the armed thugs. The sheriff is forced to tell Bethlehem about the postman's visit and his claims about the president and Congress. The general orders his men to pursue him. After the bandits leave, John, despite the sheriff's protests, puts on the postman's uniform and sets off southward with the letters. Meanwhile, the postman arrives at Fort Benning, where he delivers more mail. The people rejoice. It means order might soon be restored in the country. The postman tells them that people have survived everywhere, even if not many. Soon the cities will rise from the ruins. Suddenly, the alarm sounds. Bethlehem's troops are approaching. But to the general's surprise, the townspeople refuse to open the gates and tell him there's a representative of the real government inside. Furious, General Bethlehem decides to take the town by force and begins issuing orders to prepare the cannons. The townspeople want to resist, but their mayor reminds them they only have 5 rifles. Unexpectedly, the postman asks to negotiate, and the people suggest he do it himself. After all, he's the government's representative. The postman approaches the general with a white flag. Bethlehem doesn't recognize him, though the man's face seems familiar. The general is enraged when the postman declares that Congress has reconvened and the states will soon be restored. But the postman names the city where the government now resides and speaks convincingly about the new president. For now, he says, things can stay the same. The people will open the gates and give their tribute if they are left unharmed. But General Bethlehem rejects the offer, orders the assault to begin, and commands his men to kill the postman. At that moment, Abby, held in the general's tent, knocks out her guard, grabs his weapon, and just in time, shoots the postman's escorts, saving him. She fires at the general next, forcing him to duck behind barrels. Seizing the moment, the postman knocks a bandit off his horse, jumps into the saddle, and rescues Abby, who has just run out of bullets. Together, they fight their way into the mountains, where Abby discovers the postman is seriously wounded. But as she tries to help him, one of the bandits catches up with them. He's not afraid of the gun in her hands. He saw her run out of ammunition, but Abby knocks him down and bludgeons him with a rock. The postman loses consciousness. In fragmented visions, he sees snow starting to fall, and Abby dragging him through the mountains using a makeshift sled. A fierce blizzard erases their tracks, and soon the two reach a hunter's cabin in the Blue Mountains. When the postman regains consciousness, Abby tells him about her husband's death. Then suddenly, she puts a knife to his throat. She saw the number 8 burned into his arm, but the man reminds her that she too spent time in Bethlehem's camp and didn't become one of his followers. She's forced to admit he's right. Time passes, and the couple runs out of food. The postman grows weaker and more despondent. Abby decides to slaughter their horse. She cooks him a hot meal, insisting he must recover quickly and get back to doing what matters. But the postman wants no more trouble and avoids any talk of resistance. Abby does all the chores, caring for him, while he lies by the window, staring outside. One day, while fetching water, she slips off an icy log and falls into a stream. Hearing her cries, the postman forgets his injury, rushes to the water, and rescues her. Now he takes care of her, feeding her the last of their meat. Suddenly, Abby confesses she's pregnant, and not by the general. Though Bethlehem pursued her, she never gave in. For that, he beat her regularly. The postman apologizes for what she went through. Finally, spring arrives. One day, the postman is enjoying the sun when Abby points to the now open mountain pass. It means they can return to civilization. To prevent him from backing out, she sets the cabin on fire, knowing it's the only way she can convince him to leave. They descend into the valley. On the way, the postman tells her about the fabled city of St. Rose and swears he'll find it. Suddenly, they meet a teenage girl delivering mail. She's shocked they've never heard of the postman, the greatest man in the new history of the United States. He spat in General Bethlehem's face and returned to President Starkey in the East. All of this was told by Postmaster Ford, who's in contact with the restored Congress. The couple travels with the girl to a small town where they witness Ford reading a letter from the postman aloud to his couriers. In it, he urges them to keep going and continue rebuilding the nation. One of the boys recognizes the legendary postman. Ford runs up and embraces him, explaining that after leaving Pineview, he created a postal network connecting communities across the Pacific Northwest. In addition to delivering letters, the service spreads faith in the government's restoration and calls for resistance to Bethlehem's tyranny. With pride, he shows how 30 routes now operate, served by young couriers, and more are joining every day. The postman meets an old paratrooper who trains the youth, sharing his knowledge of resistance tactics. Meanwhile, Bethlehem's men capture a young courier. Upon learning about the postal service, the general launches a hunt for the messengers. The postman resumes his work, delivering and receiving letters across settlements. More and more people hear from their loved ones, and soon songs fill the towns. Life is returning. One day, the postman returns to Pineview, where the sheriff admits he misjudged him. The postman hands him a letter from his sister, whom he had believed dead. That evening, the townsfolk gather to celebrate. The postman invites Abby to a slow dance, signaling his feelings for her. But after the dance, she quietly walks away, still unsure if she's ready to start a new relationship. At the same time, Bethlehem's men track and kill several more young couriers. The general is furious. The letters contain nothing important, just news of harvest, children, and the dead. But that's what terrifies him. He intensifies his terror campaign, lashing out at the ordinary people of the settlements. In response, the postman asks the old paratrooper to teach them warfare. One day, luring a segment of Bethlehem's unit into an ambush, the couriers completely wipe them out. However, burdened by guilt over the couriers' deaths, the postman increasingly volunteers for the most dangerous routes, much to Abby's disapproval. One night, a burning truck crashes into Bethlehem's camp. Scrawled across it, "Postal Delivery." The bed is filled with the corpses of bandits. The already unhinged general goes into a rage. The conflict turns into open war. Bethlehem declares that he will march north, killing 10 people in every town until the postman surrenders in Pineview. But Ford takes it upon himself to write a letter to the general, declaring that no one will surrender. When the postman learns of this, he becomes furious. More and more young boys and girls are dying. He scolds Ford for acting on his own, but Ford insists he did the right thing. There can be no victory without sacrifice. Meanwhile, Bethlehem captures Pineview, but in vain awaits the postman's arrival. He orders 10 townspeople, including the sheriff, to be brought to the square, not knowing that the postman and several couriers have indeed arrived and are watching from a nearby mountain. Bethlehem gives the order to execute the hostages. They are killed, but before dying, the sheriff shouts that the postman must not stop. The massacre has a terrible impact on the postman. Feeling that his lie has gone too far, the postman decides to disband the postal service, claiming he received a letter from the president instructing all couriers to return to their settlements and burn their uniforms. The couriers weep but obey the order from the supposed head of state. Only Ford realizes the letter isn't from the president at all. But the postman insists that if Starkey were real, he would have written the same, to stop more youth from dying. He tells Ford he's written a letter to General Bethlehem stating that there is no restored government and that the postal service is disbanded. He plans to deliver it to the general in person tomorrow, but Ford refuses to let the postman take the letter himself and volunteers to go, knowing he won't return. After a long argument, the postman gives in and lets the boy take on the deadly task. He begins gathering his things. Abby asks the postman not to blame the boy. The younger generation hasn't lived through what their elders have. They've only just found a cause worth dying for. That's why they cling so desperately to the service. The man finally admits the truth. He tells Abby how it all really happened. To his surprise, she says she suspected as much for a long time, but she's not angry. He's still done a lot of good. The postman tells her he plans to leave for St. Rose and wants her to come with him. She's carrying his child after all. At that moment, a former courier, now a captive turned follower of Bethlehem, appears. He's been ordered by the great Bethlehem to kill the postman, but the postman calmly tells him that Bethlehem is just a madman obsessed with killing. The real hero is Ford. The couple rides off, leaving the boy in confusion. Meanwhile, Ford delivers a letter to Bethlehem. In it, the postman writes that there is no restored United States and no real postal service, but that he still believes it's not over. At that moment, the former courier returns and confirms that the postman really did abandon everything and rode off with his woman. He claims he just couldn't get close enough to carry out the order. The general orders Ford to be executed along with another courier they had previously captured. Standing before the firing squad, the two couriers speak. The second is from California, meaning the process of restoring the nation is continuing. Upon hearing this, General Bethlehem realizes the only way to stop it is to capture all couriers and kill the postman. He personally shoots the boy from California and decides to keep Ford alive as bait. Meanwhile, the postman, Abby, and 3 couriers travel westward, far from Holness territory. Soon they arrive at the settlement of Bridge City, built atop the dam of an old hydroelectric plant. The town is run by a man who, before the war, was a famous rock musician, Tom Petty. He welcomes them and asks them to surrender their weapons, as no arms are allowed in the town. The people are friendly and provide food and rest, but the next day, Bethlehem's soldiers arrive, looking for the famous postman. A child in the crowd asks who that is. At that moment, the postman's companions hand him the cap they had saved. He's forced to put it on again. Tom Petty decides to help the postman escape, despite the threats from the Holness. Unexpectedly, the postman refuses to flee. He asks Abby to go somewhere safe without him. She cries, afraid he'll never find St. Rose and never see his child. She confesses that she loves him. Tom Petty escorts the postman to the top of the station, where he crosses the river via cable car. He begins rallying nearby towns for a final battle with the Holness. His allies do the same, riding to all settlements and calling for resistance. Soon an army arrives at General Bethlehem's camp, marching under the flag of the United States, made up mostly of women and teenagers. Bethlehem is pleased that someone has finally dared to fight him. He orders Ford to be brought to the battlefield, hoping to use him as leverage against the postman. Then the postman himself rides forward. He reminds everyone that both he and Bethlehem are nothing more than pretenders. The general was once just a merchant. Wishing to avoid further bloodshed, the postman challenges Bethlehem to a duel, invoking Rule Number 7 from the Holness Code, which allows any clan member to challenge the leader's right to command through single combat. Bethlehem laughs, claiming the postman isn't a Holness, but the postman reveals the branded number 8 on his arm, stunning everyone, including his own couriers. Then he recites lines from Shakespeare about resisting tyranny. It's only now that Bethlehem realizes the truth, that the escaped man known as Shakespeare and the postman are one and the same. He accepts the challenge and the two men engage in battle. Both are equally matched and both understand what's at stake. Eventually, Bethlehem reaches for a saber and prepares to strike the postman down, believing he has nothing to fight for. No values, no faith. But the postman suddenly declares that he does believe in the restored United States. He strikes Bethlehem hard in the head. Gaining the upper hand, the postman begins to win, but then stops, unwilling to become like the bandits he despises. Ford steps forward, reminding him of rule number 3, mercy is for the weak, and rule number 8, there is only one punishment, death. The crowd shouts their support, but the postman gently pushes Ford's pistol aside and proclaims new rules. The first, do not kill, live in peace. Ford fires, but deliberately misses, agreeing to end the cycle of violence. But the defeated tyrant refuses to accept his loss. Snatching Ford's gun, he tries to shoot the postman. He is stopped by Colonel Getty, once Bethlehem's most loyal officer. Getty shoots the general, killing him. Then in front of everyone, the tongueless soldier throws down his rifle. Time passes. Abby gives birth to a daughter and names her Hope on the very day the postman returns from another journey devoted to rebuilding the postal service in the nation. 30 years later, on a bright day, the postman's grown daughter officially unveils a statue of her great father in the new city of St. Rose, a city he never got to see with his own eyes. Yachts float on the water, everyone is dressed in clean modern clothing, and some hold advanced cameras. The cloth is pulled away from the statue, revealing a bronze figure of a man on horseback. The inscription reads that it was the postman who revived civilization and gave the new generation hope. One man recalls how, long ago, he waited for the postman to deliver his letter. The sculptor captured that exact moment in the statue. The Postman is more than just an adventure film. It is a reflection on the power of unity and hope in the darkest of times. This film will resonate with those who believe change is possible, and that even in a ruined world, it is vital to keep faith in something better.